So I assume you've all gotten the syllabus, such as it is, the outline for the course. It's very simple. The wisdom literature consists really of 5 books in the Bible, 3 of them in the Hebrew Bible, the books of Proverbs, Kohelet, and Job, and then 2 in the Apocrypha or deuterocanonical books, if you like. Deuterocanonical meaning they're canonical in the Catholic Church, but not in the Protestant churches, by and large. These books, Ben Sira was written in Hebrew. It's the only apocryphal book that is actually cited by the rabbis. And then the Wisdom of Solomon, it's a very interesting book with which we will conclude, which was actually written in Greek and has a good sprinkling of Greek philosophy mixed in with it, which is quite exceptional in the whole corpus of the Old Testament. But tonight, for starters, what I want to do is talk about what is wisdom. Now, the wisdom books are actually so-called simply because they use the word wisdom a lot. Now, that doesn't quite amount to a literary theory for identifying a genre, but at the same time, I think it counts for something. Most scholars, in my lifetime at least, have thought that the wisdom literature is probably the most easily recognizable category in all of the Bible, or at least as recognizable as any other. And the reasons for it are this. If you look, first of all, at the books in the actual Hebrew Bible, these are the only books in the Bible that never talk about Israel. They never talk about what we might call a history of salvation. No, there is no revelation at Sinai. There is no haranguing by prophets. What you have is simply instructional literature. Now, this instructional literature, I'll describe it in a little bit more detail in a minute, but it's direct speech. It's either in the form of statements presented as factual statements. Now, whether they're factual or not might be another question, but at least that's how they're presented. And sometimes then as commands and prohibitions, or at least very strong advice. Because basically what this literature is advice. It is something, it doesn't have the same kind of moral urgency that you get in the prophets. You know, where the prophets are either blessing you or cursing you most of the time. Wisdom literature tends to be calm. It just states certain facts, makes deductions from them, and it's cast really as the advice that a father might give his son. That's kind of the overarching category for it. It does not claim to be divinely inspired. And it is, I won't say it's the only literature in the Old Testament that doesn't, but it's exceptional in the Old Testament in that regard. Now, all of that, I think, makes it quite a distinctive block of material. In spite of that, in the last, 5, 6, 7 years or so, there has been a little controversy in biblical scholarship, inspired by a number of scholars who have proclaimed an obituary for wisdom literature. Now, in the bibliography that I gave you there is a volume edited by a man named Will Kynes, and he also wrote a book, an obituary for wisdom literature, claiming, in effect, that there is no such thing. Now, in fairness to Kynes, he admits that you can group these books together, but he says you might as well group them with any other group. Now, this is kind of hard to fathom, really, because actually this literature looks quite distinctive. And what's going on there, I think, in large part, is a theological issue. Since the wisdom literature doesn't talk about special revelation, doesn't talk about Israel coming out of Egypt or of revelation on Mount Sinai, then it looks somewhat secular. Secular, I'm sure, isn't quite the right word for it, because there is no literature from the ancient world that doesn't assume God, doesn't assume some kind of divine guidance in things, but at the same time, it doesn't have the claim that one segment of humanity has been let in on a secret by God when the rest of humanity has not. In the wisdom literature, this is presented as something that is in principle accessible to everyone. And my guess is that that is what these scholars don't like, that this is what they are resisting. Now, it is true enough to say that you can find wisdom elements more or less everywhere. And we'll turn in a minute to talking about how you recognize a wisdom saying when you see one. But, there are wisdom sayings that get thrown into the books of the prophets and into some of the narrative books and so forth. Because in many ways, I think the wisdom literature is probably the oldest stratum of material that we have. And it is more like the common substratum rather than, very often it's cast as a kind of appendix at the end of the Old Testament. But actually, most of this is the kind of stuff that pretty much everybody would have dealt with to some degree. It's the claims of special revelation and the prophetic literature that are distinctive in that regard, that are exceptional. So that much, I think, is true. But it remains very much the case that this is a very distinctive block of literature. Now, how would you recognize wisdom sayings if you saw them? Well, to gear up for that, the best thing to do is read the book of Proverbs and see how far you get in it before you fall asleep. I doubt that you'll make it all the way through, because it's not meant to be read as a whole. It's a collection of sayings. Now, the kinds of material you have in it are, first of all, simple observations claiming to be observations of fact. That now, these may in fact be somewhat tendentious. A lot of them are folk proverbs. You get these also scattered in other books of the Bible. For example, in the prophet Ezekiel, there is a passage where he says, the parent, do not say this anymore in Israel. The parents have eaten sour grapes and the teeth of the children are set on edge. Well, now, this obviously was a proverb. Every country has these. There are collections of African proverbs. And, they're not all that different actually in substance. So on that level, I think you're dealing with a pretty universal genre of folk literature. But then there is another kind of thing, which is the wisdom instruction. Now, there is actually one of the great discoveries, over the last 200 years or so, our understanding of the Bible has been changed radically by the discovery of other literature from the ancient Near East. One big block of this literature comes from ancient Egypt. And I'm holding up here for you a book, Ancient Egyptian Literature by Miriam Lichtheim, which has a lot of this material. Now, there is a whole genre of what we would call wisdom instructions that goes back to the 3rd millennium BC. That's about 2,000 years before the time of Moses. There are several famous collections like this. One of the most famous is the instruction of Amen-Em-Opeh. Now, we'll come back to Amen-Em-Opeh because this was written somewhere in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. But it seems that whoever wrote the book of Proverbs knew the wisdom of Amen-Em-Opeh and actually copied it in some part, not all the way, but some part of it. This beginning of the teaching of life, the instruction for well-being, every rule of relation with elders, for conduct toward magistrates, knowing how to answer one who speaks, to reply to one who sends a message, so as to direct him in the paths of life, to make him prosper upon the earth, to let him enter its shrine. Now, it goes on like that. You get the message fairly early on. This is educational literature. This was literature that was used in education. And this is probably how it came into Israel too. In ancient Egypt, they made these collections of sayings to educate scribes who would work for the Pharaoh in different branches of government. And they describe some of these now as you go on in Amen-Em-Opeh. They talk about, scribes who keep track of rations, scribes who keep track of temple records, of all sorts of dealings. If you're running an empire, you need to have scribes. And in ancient Egypt especially, they had them, and lots of them. They had them also in ancient Mesopotamia, but we don't have as much literature from there. And these collections of sayings were used in basic education. Now, actually, when I started school, I'm old enough to have had this experience. I don't know whether any of you are, but the teacher would write Proverbs on the blackboard. This isn't the only thing they did, but it was one of the things that they did. And you would copy those Proverbs, or sayings. Honesty is the best policy. He who hesitates is lost, or whatever. And you did this for 2 reasons. First of all, to learn how to write. And secondly, to learn the message, to have a certain ethos instilled into you. Now, that, I think, goes way back to the 3rd millennium BC in ancient Egypt. This is how they trained their scribes. Now, I don't think there's any real doubt. The oldest of the wisdom books in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Proverbs. And I don't think that there's any real doubt that the book of Proverbs, as we have it, was meant to be something like these wisdom instructions. It was instructional literature for training scribes. Now, it's a big question. What was education like in ancient Israel? Did they have schools? Well, it doesn't actually seem that they did, not until about the 1st century BC. What they did have was certain people who learned how to write, certain people who became scribes, and then other people who apprenticed themselves to them. So you had an apprenticeship model and a tutorial model of education. And that, I think, is what you had down till about the 1st century BC. Now, for a long time, it was held that the wisdom literature originated with King Solomon. And this was tied to a view of Israelite religion and the history of Israel that hasn't stood up so well in recent years. But if you read the Bible straight through, you come away with the impression that Solomon was the first king in Israel who had something that could be called an empire. And it's often called the Solomonic Empire. According to the Book of Kings, Solomon married a daughter of Pharaoh, among many other people, among the 1100 or so that he married altogether. But that he established diplomatic relations with other peoples around. And for that purpose, he needed to have scribes. And so the theory went that in the time of Solomon, the Israelites had, so to speak, come down from the hills, and that you had a Solomonic enlightenment. And that under Solomon, then, you had people who learned a little bit about international culture and learned how to communicate with scribes from other people, so that if you want to send emissaries to Egypt or to Mesopotamia, they can speak those languages and communicate. Now, only a tiny sliver of the population would have, in fact, been educated. Now, this hasn't held up so well because there was a huge controversy in the 1990s as to how big was Jerusalem in the time of Solomon. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a periodical called Biblical Archaeology Review, which is actually very good. They give you beautiful photos of scenes in ancient Israel, and they tell you about all the new discoveries as they come up. And in the 1990s, the controversy was Jerusalem an imperial capital, or was it a cow town? And the consensus that emerged from it was that it was much more like a cow town. Now, cows may not have been the primary commodity that they had. Maybe it was a camel town, but it wasn't a very big place. That's the point. And on the view of Israelite history that's taken hold more recently, it was only in the time of King Hezekiah, and that he was about the last quarter of the 700s, says 725 to 700, that it was only at that time that Jerusalem grew big enough to support the kind of bureaucratic apparatus that gets ascribed to Solomon in the Bible. In fact, in Proverbs chapter 25, at the beginning of the chapter, it says, "These are other Proverbs of Solomon that the officials of King Hezekiah of Judah copied." So there was some kind of activity in the time of Hezekiah, where Hezekiah sent out people to collect these sayings, to make books for educating scribes. Now, that happened maybe about 700. Whether some of that happened in the time of Solomon, I think, is hard enough to say. I'm not entirely convinced that none of it could have happened. It doesn't seem to have been as much of an enlightenment in the time of Solomon as the Bible sometimes makes it out to be. But even so, I think Solomon too probably had some need of scribes and some need of administrative officials. There are a couple of passages in the Book of Kings that talk about Solomon and his wisdom. The first one is in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29. That's in the English. The numbering is different in the Hebrew. God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding, as vast as the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the children of Machol. Now, apparently, Heman, Calcol, and Darda were famous in their day. They're not famous now. We have no idea who these people were. But it says he was more wiser than all the people of the East. His fame surpassed all the surrounding nations. Now, the main thing to note from that is that the standard for wisdom was international. It doesn't tell you he knew more about the history of Israel than anybody else. The thing is, he knew more of the kind of wisdom that other people valued than anybody else. And that's what you're looking for in the wisdom literature, is the kind of wisdom that other people valued. It goes on. He composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He would speak of animals and birds and reptiles and fish. And people came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of this wisdom. Now, you get the impression that you mightn't have wanted to be stuck with Solomon at a cocktail party. That the kind of thing he liked to talk about mightn't have been what would be the most interesting for everybody. But that he seemed to have a kind of encyclopedic knowledge. Now, that's one aspect of wisdom, and we'll see more of it, especially in the later wisdom books, where they speculate a lot about the nature of the cosmos, about the nature of the world and how the world works. But it isn't, generally speaking, what defines wisdom. The other passage in 1 Kings then talks about how Solomon prayed for wisdom. That's in chapter 3, when God offered him, in effect, more as it said, ask me for anything you want. And what Solomon prayed for was wisdom, to make him a wise ruler. Now, that one, again, stands in the tradition that that's what you should look for. But again, it's not at all a matter of special revelation. It's a matter of knowing the kind of things that any human being ought to know, and then having the wit and understanding to grasp them properly. Now, that much said, now, Kelly, by the way, if at any point somebody comes up with a pertinent question in the chat, you can break in or signal to me, and we can take it. And otherwise, we'll set time aside for that at the end. What you get in the book of Proverbs, you have two kinds of material for starters. The first 9 chapters consist of long wisdom instructions. These are long discursive material, where there are lectures, if you like. And then beginning in chapter 10, you have proverbs and sayings, the sayings sometimes being in the form of admonitions. But they're all one-liners or two-liners from Proverbs 10 on, until you get to the end of the book, and then you have another long discourse, actually, on the good woman in Proverbs chapter 31. We'll probably get to that next week. But what I want to look at for starters tonight is the material in Proverbs 10 to 30, or 10 to 29. This is the short sayings, which I take to be the kind of substratum of the wisdom material. Now, what do you have in that? first thing I would say that you have is observation on experience. And as an example, I offer you Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 and following. I passed by the field of one who was lazy, by the vineyard of a stupid person. And see, it was all overgrown with thorns, and the ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. Now remember, all of this material is cast as instruction by a father to a son. And a lot of it, you can picture in that kind of a context. The advice fathers give their sons tends to be conservative, I would say. It tends to be cautious. It tends to err on the side of caution. It also tends to assume, that doing what I tell you is the way to success. And that's certainly the kind of tone that you get in this literature here. Now, sometimes these observations, of course, can be dubious enough. In principle, it all claims to be based on experience. In practice, usually, I would say, wisdom advice relies on tradition. We will see this actually, it becomes the source of drama in the book of Job, because Job's experience didn't mesh with what his friends, the wisdom teachers, thought it should be. And what they will say to Job is very typically, listen now, what have your fathers told you? What have people always said? Good people succeed. Do the right thing and you will prosper. And Job says, well, it isn't working for me. And that creates something of a crisis in the wisdom literature. Now, Koheleth, also, the book of Ecclesiastes, which we'll do after Proverbs, one of the distinctive things in Koheleth is he decided to check things out for himself. This remains true to the present day. If you go with the shibboleths that are handed down on anything, you will come away with a very conservative view of the world. And then if you actually check it out and see, does this actually work? A lot of the time you'll find it doesn't, especially. And so that creates some of the drama in some of the later wisdom books. But I think in the book of Proverbs, the reliability of tradition is not questioned. It is simply taken for granted. A nice example of that. Now, some of these observations, including, I think, the one I read you about a little sleep and a little slumber and a little folding of the hands to rest, may be fair enough. But some of it also becomes a bit tendentious. There's a famous passage in the Psalms, in Psalm 37, verse 25. I have never seen the righteous man go hungry or his children begging bread. And you wonder how hard had the person who wrote that really looked. It's the same kind of problem we'll have in the book of Job, where his friends say, if affliction befalls you in life, you must have done something to deserve it. And that, doesn't actually check out. It doesn't hold up under examination. But you will get a lot of it in Proverbs. If you look, for example, at Proverbs chapter 10, a wise child makes a glad father, and a foolish child is a mother's grief. That's probably true enough. Treasures gained by wickedness do not profit. Now I wonder, how many of you believe that? If you look around you in the world we live in, does that hold up? The treasures gained by wickedness do not profit. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, and he thwarts the craving of the wicked. But again, that doesn't always seem to be the case. You know, it's a very harsh assumption that anyone who is going hungry is therefore unrighteous. But mind you, it's an assumption that has had great staying power because people want to believe that the world makes sense. This is really the basic drive that you have in the wisdom literature, is the drive to make connections between things so that you can reassure yourself that it does make sense. Again, there a slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Yeah, again, some of the time, maybe it does, but to make it into a generalization is pushing it a bit. So there is a kind of inbuilt tension in this wisdom literature as you get it in Proverbs between the appeal to experience on the one hand and the desire to generalize. And when you generalize, usually the tendency is to generalize on the basis of how you think things ought to be rather than how they actually are. Now, that's, as I say, the most basic level of wisdom is observe how things are. The second step in it is to extend that by analogy. Now, there are analogies scattered through the book. I'll just look at a few of them. In Proverbs 25, verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Like a gold ring or an ornament of robe is a wise rebuke to a listening ear. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest are faithful messengers to those who send them. Like clouds and wind without rain is one who boasts of a gift never given. Now, if you do actually give it a shot and try to read through Proverbs, one of the things that you need to look for is humor. And there is, mind you, a fair bit of humor, as there is, I think, in that one, of the man who boasts of a gift that is never given. Like a bad tooth or a lame foot is trust in a faithless person in time of trouble. Or again, continuing on into chapter 26. Like snow in summer or rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. Like a sparrow in its flitting, like a swallow in its flying, an undeserved curse goes nowhere. Or like an archer who wounds everybody is one who hires a passing fool or a drunkard. Like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who reverts to his folly. Now, you know, as I say, these comparisons are often quite witty. They're also often quite tendentious. You know, is the dog returning to his vomit always the best analogy for a foolish person? Well, you know, that is maybe a matter of opinion. These comparisons, you know, incline you to see the world in a certain way. And in doing so, they shape your perception of the world. But by making these analogies, you're also trying to connect things. And this, I would say, wisdom is kind of primitive philosophy. And the basic thrust of the enterprise is, to see, to make connections and to see, what kind of connections you can make between things. I see a hand from Ellie Sullivan. You want to give it a shot, Ellie? Ellie, can you hear me?
I apologize. I think I leaned on a button that I shouldn't have.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Apologies.
If you can lean on it again and take down the hand, that would maybe be clarified. Thanks. Okay. Now, so these are two of the kind of basic things you do in wisdom literature. If you generalize a bit from that, what do you find? I would say there was a German scholar named Klaus Koch who wrote a famous article on, it was called in German, the Tun-Ergehen Zusammenhang, which is to say the chain of act and consequence. Simple example of it, he who digs a pit will fall into it. No smoke without a fire. It's that kind of thing. Nothing happens without some antecedent cause. That passage I read you of the man who went by the field of a lazy man. Laziness leads to poverty. Now, that, I think, is as near to a dogma as you will ever find in the Bible at all, really, and certainly in the wisdom literature. And the dogma is that one thing leads to another. Nothing happens without a cause. This is one of those wisdom elements that you get cited in the prophets. That the prophet Amos says, can disaster befall a city if Yahweh hasn't done it, if God hasn't done it? There is no smoke without a fire. So that, I would say, is one of the most basic principles that you have in it. Now, besides that kind of rudimentary philosophizing, you also get, spasms of practical advice. One of my favorite pieces is in chapter 23. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is put before you. Put a knife to your throat if you have a big appetite. Okay, you're advising your son or daughter who is going off to college. You want them to learn how to behave in polite society. Don't wolf down your food. Is this the kind of thing you expect to get in the Bible? Well, why not? Do not desire the ruler's delicacies. They are deceptive food. Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Be wise enough to desist. Do not eat the bread of the stingy. Do not desire their delicacies. For like a hair in the throat, so are they. Eat and drink, they say to you, but they don't mean it. You'll vomit up the little you have eaten, and you will waste your pleasant words. Now, this is entirely pragmatic. I think there's no moral principle involved in any of that. But, it's the kind of thing that people need to learn in the course of their education. How to behave in an acceptable way in society. This is the part of the book of Proverbs that seems to have been copied from the Egyptian wisdom of Amenemope. And, this was largely for training scribes, training people so that they could function in the civil service, so to speak. And that's what you've got in it. One other characteristic of Proverbs in chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be a fool yourself. Next verse. Answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes. Which are you supposed to do? Well, that I think actually tells you a lot about the nature of this literature. It isn't simply giving you answers. And we'll find this much more clearly stated actually in the book of Koheleth or Ecclesiastes. Wisdom is not a matter of memorizing an answer book. Wisdom is knowing which answer applies in a particular situation. In this case, the wise person knows when it's the right time to answer a fool according to his folly, but the fool gets that wrong. It's also, what we'll read in Koheleth or Ecclesiastes is there's a time for everything under heaven. There's a time to love and there's a time to hate. There's a time to kill as well as a time to give life. There is a time for everything. Wisdom is a matter of timing. And that's really what they're trying to teach, is that sense of recognizing the right time. And the way you get at that, you see, is by learning a lot of precedents, of examples, so that you can think of analogies that this situation is like that situation and become wise that way. To be wise and to be well informed are not just the same thing. You can be very well informed and not be wise at all. Does God come into any of this? Well, I think God comes into it actually in two ways. The first one is God is the guarantor of the chain of act and consequence. Who sees to it that a person who digs a pit will fall into it? Well, presumably God. Now, again, this may not always work out, but I think that's where people think God has a role in it. God is the force that maintains order in the world. And this, I think, is in fact one of the basic reasons for believing in a God at all. Who makes the flowers come up in the spring? Who makes the leaves fall off the tree at a certain time in the fall? Well, that's God. You might say it's the force of nature, but it's whatever that force is that that embeds an element of rationality in nature, that embeds an element of predictability and reliability in nature. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that God is where we come up against the limits of what human beings can do. Because there is a recognition in all of this literature that, that there really is a limit to it. Strongest statement of that probably in the book of Proverbs in chapter 30. Thus says the man, I am weary, O God, I am weary, I am too stupid to be a human, I do not have human understanding. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in the hollow of his hand? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? That, who has gone up to heaven and come down? Now, this was written, we don't know exactly when, but certainly I'd say before the Hellenistic period, written back 400 or 500 BC. By the time you get down to 300 BC or 200 BC, you'll begin to find people claiming that they have gone up to heaven and come down and have all the wisdom. That's what we call apocalyptic literature. But the prophets already claimed to do that to some degree. But the wisdom teachers do not claim to do that. They're very open and upfront. They have not gone up to heaven and come down, and therefore they do not, in fact, have all the answers. And it's when you come up against the limit of human knowledge that you encounter the fear of the Lord. Now, that's something, that's emphasized very much at the beginning of the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, when they said fear, they meant fear, because it's the sense that the world is run by a power that is immensely more powerful than we are and that we do not at all understand. And therefore, you have to be very cautious. This is very typical of the ancient world. You get this in Greek tragedy too. You shouldn't try to rise up too high. You shouldn't stick your head up too high. If you do, you'll attract attention and you'll get cut down. So fear is keeping your head down, hoping that you don't get noticed, and going with the flow. That's kind of the ethos that you'll get in this wisdom literature. And it's the fear of the Lord, because there's the recognition that there is a higher power and that we don't really understand it properly.